Hello, everyone. Author R. Weir here. Hope everyone's had a great day. Our podcast, vodcast, as they like to say now, video podcast, bringing life to characters. I have a author here from Canada. It's my second straight show that I have an author from Canada, so it'll be great. So I am going to bring him up here right now and say hello. So Sebastien de Castell, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on, Randy.
I appreciate you coming in from our neighbors up north. I like to say friendly neighbors, though it hasn't been so. There's been a little bit of issues. We did Left Coast Crime here, and we had a lot of Canadian authors coming in for Left Coast Crime. I was here in Denver this last year, and there was a lot of conversations about that, with which I was always apologizing for some of the stuff because Canada and the United States have always been great, friendly
Oh,
neighbors.
yeah,
So it was kind of discouraging when I hear all that. But we won't get into the politics. I try to stay out of the politics. But thanks for being
that's
on. Tell us a little about yourself, the important stuff people need to know about you.
sure. So fundamentally, I'm a fantasy novelist. I've had 17 novels published. I've been incredibly lucky to be translated into 15 languages around the world. The 16th language is coming out soon. I've had a couple of series option for film and television, which isn't as impressive as it sounds. It just means every 18 months somebody sends you a check and tells you, well, maybe next year. Um,
As long
but
as they send the check, right?
exactly, yeah. As long as the check clears, um, and yeah, I do a lot of traveling. My books are really focused a lot on themes of idealism and swashbuckling and found families and friendship and banter, which is a very Canadian thing. We always appreciate good banter here. And so, yeah, that's really the entirety of it. I started in the strangest way imaginable, which was when I was 16 years old. I was camping by myself on an island off the coast of British Columbia, and I ended up 4 hours early for the next ferry to take me to the next island, and found a book which I still have. I still have my original copy of it right here. It's called Bard by Keith Taylor, and it was this incredible fantasy novel about a sixth century Irish bard who traveled the world, went on adventures, swung a sword, sang songs, and told stories. And I thought, that's the job for me. Uh, Unfortunately, I couldn't find any job wanted ads for bards. So over the subsequent decades, I did every kind of job imaginable, from being in a touring band, a rock band. I was a terrible actor for a while. I choreographed sword fights for the theater. I did everything from project management to teaching to just a ton of different sort of careers along the way. And so managed to kind of get to live the life of a bard in aggregate, because I did get to travel the world. I did get to swing a sword and sing songs, and then ultimately became a novelist. And now I make my living telling stories. So yeah, I got there eventually.
So I found this picture on your website. Looking very dapper there.
Yeah, that's
So, what was this? And what were you actually doing an actual sword fight, or was it some type of
That
event?
that's just how Canadians dress, Randy. We all dress like faux 18th century noblemen with rapiers at our side. That's an old photo when I was choreographing sword fights. There was I think the first play I ever choreographed was at a community theater in Vancouver, and it was a production of Dangerous Liaisons, and they wanted us to put on a demonstration to promote the play at the Vancouver Public Library. And so I did a sword fight right there in the library atrium. As you can see, there's some other 18th century looking people behind me, and yeah, it was a it was a fabulous time, and there were a lot of library patrons that were very confused.
Well, you look very serious there. So, was it a serious competition going on between you and whoever your opponent was?
Well, my opponent was an actress, and I can't remember if she was in the play, that actual play, or not. But we had to do a little bit of a sword fight with very little training, and so I was desperately concerned with not actually killing someone who hadn't done much sword fighting in their lives. So it was very serious in that sense. But no, that's the pose of me just as she's saying something rude to me, and I'm about to challenge her back. But as you can see by the anachronistic clothing, somewhat anachronistic clothing compared to my compatriots in the background, because I was the fight choreographer for the play, not an actor. There wasn't an actual proper costume for me. So, for example, my highly inauthentic fitted black leggings are bicycle pants.
Oh, really? So they almost look like you're wearing really tall boots there too, but I can't tell for
I
sure.
was I was wearing really tall boots. Those
Yeah.
those were semi-authentic. I think those belonged to a friend of mine, and they were, I think, 3 sizes too small for my feet.
Oh,
So,
so you couldn't
so
get
it
them
was
off afterwards, right?
it was well, my feet probably swelled to 3 sizes larger afterwards. So yeah, it was definitely a feat getting them removed. But it was a blast. I loved choreographing sword fights. I loved the theater. I love actors, and the world of the theater is just as kind of wild, magical, and crazy as people often say, which is why Play of Shadows, which is a recent novel of mine, is a swashbuckling fantasy set in the theater. And part of it, the basis of it was sort of based on some experiences I had, even though it's a fantasy novel, some experiences I had when I was in London choreographing a production of Richard III, where they weren't doing the Shakespearean Richard III. They wanted to do a more historically accurate one because the Shakespearean version, makes him out to be this kind of almost comical monster, and the real Richard III was quite different. And there's the lovely cover right there. And so I wrote this fantasy novel about a group of actors who are performing this historical play, and there's a kind of a phenomenon in this world where certain actors are so good that they channel the actual spirits of the historical characters that they play on stage. And so people pay a fortune to go see these particular types of actors. They're called varistors. And our main character, Damalas, is not a varistor. He's basically a failed actor who was fleeing a judicial duel and hid out in the theater and convinced them to let him stay because in this city, because they respect the theater so much, actors in the grand operatos, as they're called, don't have to fight judicial duels. They can step away from honor duels, and so he's hiding out there, playing bit parts. But he, at one point when he's on stage, he accidentally suddenly blurts something out that's not the correct line. In fact, what he says makes it sound as if the great hero of the city, who sort of won this wonderful victory 100 years ago against this horrible villain who'd killed these two children, is that hero is actually the true villain. And so that sets off a whole firestorm of people accusing them of being seditionists, and then suddenly a new duke who wants to find out the truth of what happened, and they're forced to actually put on a play about the villain to see whether you can find out what really happened in the past. And so it's this kind of really wonderful sequence of conflicts and sword fights and trips into these sort of moments on stage where suddenly Damalas is finding himself reliving the scene in the past, even as he's trying to perform it on stage, while he's changing the scene and his fellow actors are having to improvise around him because what really happened in the past isn't what's in the script. And so yeah, that was just a tremendous amount of fun. And so in many ways, Play of Shadows was for me a kind of a culmination of taking some of those experiences I had years and years ago, probably 20 years ago, choreographing sword fights with all these wonderful actors, and then getting to kind of put them all on my own stage with all the fantasy elements of magic and assassins and everything else.
So what's all involved in choreographing a sword fight? I mean, I'm assuming it's lots of rehearsal and practice, and obviously you have to know the moves that the other person is doing. I mean, I'm sure it's very detailed.
It certainly can be. First and foremost, when you're choreographing a sword fight, what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell a story using action. So rather than telling a story through, for example, typically when you're watching a TV show, you're watching a courtroom drama, there's a lot of conflict, but you're watching a story that's told through dialogue and to some extent facial expressions. When you're doing a theater play, it can't all be facial expressions, and a sword fight often doesn't have a lot of dialogue. For example, most Shakespeare's plays, if you actually read the play, it just, at the point at which they're about to come into conflict with one another, it just says they fight, and that's it. And then the fight's over, and then it says, Paris dies, or Romeo, kills somebody, and that's it. And so the fight choreographer has to basically tell a story within that space where the fight is happening using only action. And so a lot of it translates quite well to fiction writing, in the sense that what you're basically doing is you're constructing dialogue through action. So for example, a person who is really nasty in a regular scene, a prosecutor in that courtroom drama who's just mean spirited and says cruel things. Well, we can think of cruel movements in a fight, cruel ways of attacking, nasty ways of attacking someone. And that might be part of the language you form of how they use a sword. You might see people who are terribly afraid in a courtroom drama, and you'd normally see that in their face or the tremors in the way they speak. But we can translate that into the movements and the retreats and the body language of the fight. And so that's what you do. You're trying to find that, and then you're having to figure out how to find it within the individual actor, because every actor is a different body. They have a different natural way of moving, and you want to choreograph not for some imaginary, CGI body. You want to choreograph for that human being and their body and what makes them look magnificent or terrified or things like that. And so often there is a ton of rehearsal. Often, I think most fight choreographers would say today that there's not nearly enough time for rehearsal to do everything you want to do. But there's all the other elements of constructing a scene that you would have for example, blocking, how you position people so that the angles look right, so that when somebody's being punched in the face, you can't see the 6 inches between their fist and the other person's face. So it's all those.
Can't really punch each other. Come on.
Exactly. But I mean, what was fabulous about those experiences for me is that as I moved into being a novelist, it kind of arms you with a bunch of tools that you wouldn't normally start with, and those tools being, okay, when I write an action scene, when I write a fight scene, especially a sword fight, there tends to be quite a lot of sword fights in my novels, or even if it's a magical fight, 2 wizards going at it. I'm always thinking about, how do I use the choices that they make in committing those acts of violence against each other or fighting against each other? How do I make those feel like they're revealing things about the character? Because what you want is for the reader, as they're reading this fight scene, not to be going, oh my God, this is just this long technical detail.
Right.
That's not interesting. What you want them to be doing is going, I see something about this character that wasn't said before, but I see it because of the way they're moving, because of the way they're fighting. Now I know something I didn't know before. And that usually is a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I love those experiences. It's the same, having been a performing musician for years, I made my living playing in small towns, playing Brown Eyed Girl 6 nights a week. And you sort of discover all these different things about musicality and rhythm and how people respond to it. And so, for example, that actually often helped inform my fight choreography, because you find musical rhythms that you can bury inside the sword fight, so people don't see them naturally. They're not aware of that rhythm necessarily, but they can kind of feel it. They feel the tension of those rhythms, whether you're keeping a pattern going of a certain rhythm between the 2 swords clashing, or whether you're intentionally breaking that rhythm. And it worked the same with dialogue. Dialogue has always been, to me, a kind of music. It has a musicality. And so I often spend quite a long time on dialogue, where I'm just trimming a word here. And it's not because I didn't like the word, or because someone's going to go, oh, that was one too many words. It's because I need that rhythm to keep going. So, that's, the greatest thing about being a novelist, I think, or a fiction writer, is that every different experience you've ever had, whether you're a fight choreographer, a musician, or who knows, a chemical engineer, everything you experience in some ways informs how you write.
So you mentioned about music, and you still are. Sounds like you are in various bands playing music. Is that kind of a stress relief for you? Is that you do that, or you just enjoy doing it? And what type of music and what instruments do you play?
It's the opposite of a stress reliever, and I'll tell you why. So I love bands. I love playing music. There's almost nothing that can take me away from wanting to be a novelist, but playing gigs, I really always loved. Um, but because I play so rarely now, almost universally, I get a call from a friend who will go, "Hey, I'm putting a band together for this corporate gig or this festival gig or something like that. Can you do it?" And almost universally, it'll be like, "Nope, I'm on a plane to the UK or to France or to somewhere else because I've got a book launch." Or some other book related event going on. And so what that means is when I am playing a gig, when it finally does align, I have to sit there for like 3 weeks beforehand practicing to get myself back into kind of shape. It's like deciding you're going to run a marathon when you haven't run for 6 months. You got to train like mad.
Sure.
So for me, it's very stressful because usually I'm playing with really, really, exceptional musicians. And so I'm always just conscious, like I have to somehow keep up with these guys and I can't keep up with them on talent and I can't keep up with them on experience. So I have to basically buy it through just practicing, what we used to call woodshedding all, over and over and over to kind of get to the point where at least those particular songs and those parts I can kind of hold up my end of it. So it's very stressful. But you asked instruments I play. So guitar is probably my main instrument. But I play keyboards as well. Occasionally, I'll have to play some bass on something, and I sing. Um, basically whatever someone will pay me for, I'll play. I can't play the clarinet, but I could figure it out if there's a gig.
You're the second or third author that I've talked to that does music. And at Killer Nashville this year, the two guests of honor actually went up. They have a band at the award ceremony, and they actually sang. I talked to Clay Stafford. I'm like, Clay, is this going to be the new tradition? Every guest of honor has to sing to get their awards. And so it was actually quite fun.
Yeah.
A nice change, to see them doing other things other than
Yeah, no,
running.
there's a lot of I meet a lot. Yeah, I meet a lot of authors who are also musicians. So a friend of mine who lives here in Vancouver, Ben Galley, quite a renowned indie author. He was like killer bass player. Although I think he's confessed to me that he played both a 5-string and a 6-string bass. So I haven't quite forgiven him for that. Because when you're a guitar player, the last thing you want is a bass player playing a fifth or sixth string. Like, you just like stay in your lane, pal. But I meet tons of musicians, sorry, of authors who've also been musicians.
So we want to get to your books, but I wanted to ask you about. You said you love to travel, and we talked a little bit beforehand. You've got a trip coming up. So, what are some of the exotic destinations you've gone through the years, and any of your favorites, and maybe someplace that wasn't so great?
That's a good question. So my wife and I travel a lot. It's one of the things we love doing together. So I spend a lot of time in the UK, but a lot of that's for business because both my world rights publishers are based there, and as is my literary agent. But we go to France quite often, so we clearly love those places. But some of the places that have been the most memorable for me have been places like Egypt, where we went in, I can't remember what year it was. It was the year after the big tourist massacre,
Oh,
which meant it was extremely safe because
yeah,
there was like soldiers on every street corner,
right.
and extremely cheap. So it worked out well because back then we didn't have a lot of money. Um, Morocco, cycling through Morocco, the Atlas Mountains was fabulous. Jordan is quite beautiful. And the people are just absolutely wonderful. We went on a 2-week cycling trip to Vietnam and Cambodia, where and it was a cycling trip where I managed to get, I think it was 4 different conditions at once. I had the worst food poisoning of my entire life. Now, I don't know if you write horror. I don't write horror, but I could absolutely write you a body horror based solely on the entirely accurate, factual evidence of that bout of food poisoning. And then I got a bacterial infection from that, and then I had like colitis, and then I capped it off at the end with kidney stones.
Oh,
Cambodia
wow.
is not really the optimal place to find out you have 1 centimeter kidney stones. I ended up in hospital there, and it was the most hilarious experience. And it was wonderful. The hospital, you see a lot of guidebooks warning you against going to a hospital in Cambodia, but they're so kind and so cautious and so kind of giving. And the doctor was fabulous. She was absolutely nuts. I actually dedicated one of my Spellslinger novels to her because she identified what I had instantly, even though I'd been told by a British doctor that we just come from. He thought I had a burst appendix, and she said, no, it's kidney stones. And I said, well, can we verify that? And she said, well, we could do an X-ray. And I said, okay, well, let's do the X-ray. And she said, all right, we'll do the X-ray, but I'm telling you it's kidney stones. So I go do an X-ray. She brings out the X-ray. She says, I can't see any kidney stones on the X-ray. And I go, okay, so what is it? And she said, it's kidney stones. Sometimes they don't show up on the X-ray. And I said, well, how do we verify for sure? And she said, well, we could do an MRI, but it's really, but I don't think we should. It's expensive, and
Right.
what if your travel insurance doesn't pay for it and then you're
Right.
bankrupt? And I said, our travel insurance is pretty good. I'm pretty sure it'll pay for it. And so my wife, meanwhile, is like desperately trying to get the travel insurance company on the phone to verify. And the doctor's like, but it's so expensive. And I said, we've got money. Like, no, she said, no, it's too expensive. I said, well, how much is it? She said, $400 US. And I said, I've got that in like my coin purse, lady.
As I say, yeah.
All right.
A lot of money to them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And she said, well, what do you do for a living? And I said, I'm a novelist. And she said, oh no, it's too expensive for you.
Unless you're one of the big name authors, right? You don't have a large bank account.
No, I had to convince her that I was like a successful novelist. And it was hilarious because then she said, and by the way, at this point I'm on morphine, but the morphine's worn off. And so I'm kind of rolling around in pain on the bed a little bit. And she said, I thought about writing a book once. And I said, oh, well, you should. Everyone should write a book. What would you write about? And she said, I'd write probably a medical thriller. And I said, well, those are very popular. And she said, oh, no, I couldn't write that. She said, because I always tell the truth. And if people knew what happens in hospitals, they would never go again.
That's right.
It's funny because also recently I was a guest of honor at Balticon in Baltimore. And when I flew across the border, for some reason, the border security guard, because when you fly to the US from Canada in a big airport, you go through US immigration in sort of Vancouver. And I was going through, and the guy just kept me there forever once he heard because I said, I'm going to a conference, I'm a novelist. And, he was asking what I was doing. And he was just like, really? Well, what have you written? I was like, well, I wrote this series and this series. I don't know why that's going to mean anything to you. And he literally sat there like Googling me after a while. And he's like Googling my books. And he's like, what's this one Spellslinger one about? And I'm like, well, it's about, it's a YA fantasy novel about a young man in a very magical society. All he wants to be is a mage. And as his mage's trials approach, he starts losing all his magical ability. And it's been translated into 15 languages and all this kind of stuff. And then he stops and he goes, my daughter reads a lot. I think I'll get this book for her. Go on. And then he sends me through.
You didn't realize the customs you had to convince the guy to buy a book from you to let you into the country, huh?
I know it was definitely unexpected, but a sale's a sale, as they say.
Whatever you could do. So,
yeah.
So you mentioned the one book that kind of inspired you. Are there other authors that have been inspiration to you to write the type of books you write? I mean, you're mostly fantasy, but I saw you've had some YA, maybe a little sci-fi that maybe hasn't been published, a couple other things. So.
Yeah, no. So I am predominantly a fantasy novelist. I've had 17 fantasy novels published, a short story collection of fantasy that has been bizarrely successful. I didn't know anybody still read short stories or certainly read short story collections, but somehow they keep buying this one. But yeah, I also write. So I have a science fiction novel coming out with a co-writer friend of mine, Christy Cherish, who's a great writer and a scientist, thankfully, because I failed Science 11. Um, but it's a wild astronaut novel coming out, I think, next year from Simon and Schuster. I'm not allowed to talk about too much of that, so I won't yet.
Okay.
And I've written a couple of quirky mystery novels that I really love, kind of doing a slightly modern take on kind of hard-boiled detectives.
Mhm.
Um, and and I've written a couple of these quirky mystery novels that I think, the finest crime editors in both the UK and the US all agree are unpublishable. Um, so I mean to confound those expectations. I mean, but it's yeah. So I'm probably a terrible mystery novelist, I guess, is what I'm saying.
You're
Um,
turning the mystery, they're turning that on its ear a little bit, right?
just a little bit, but I always try. It's funny because you see a lot of sort of pseudo noir films, right? And they're not really noir at all. They're just borrowing some of the lighting effects and the dialogue, but actually they're not really addressing the themes that noir was responding to at all, right? Like noir is really responding to a kind of existential crisis, predominantly between the two world wars, where people are just like, is there any point in society at all? And so, that's what they're kind of often responding to. And it doesn't mean they always have to, but I always try to stay a little bit true to that, at least when I'm writing, if I'm writing like a hard boiled novel or something. But again, since probably no one's ever going to get to read those, it hardly matters. Um, but your question about, other novelists that inspired me, there's a couple I have right here, actually. I keep them, close on my shelf and close to my heart. So Jerrig by Stephen Bruce was the first fantasy novel, I think, that as a teenager that I read. It was given to me by a friend at school, and I just fell in love with the way that he was writing, a fantasy novel almost like a hard-boiled novel. The dialogue didn't have any of the these and thous of, Tolkien style fantasy, and so I quite loved that. But I was also inspired by guys like Charles Deland, great Canadian writer. Was an urban fantasy, and just that was just rich in themes and sort of lyrical styles and things like that. And it's funny, YA wise, when I write YA fantasy, this is Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey, which is a book that I still go back and reread periodically. And I think what I love about the way that she wrote this particular book is it's about a young woman who wants to be a harper, a kind of bard. So you can see the connection for me right there. But she lives in this place where, women or girls aren't supposed to be allowed to be musicians, and she has to run away, and she ends up finding little tiny dragons and this whole bit. And the funny thing is, in no way does that reflect my existence. No one has ever said to me, you're not allowed to be a musician or something like that. And yet I could completely relate to the character. And I think that's what I love, are, writers who can, whatever gender, whatever other demographic qualities there are about a character, they kind of open a door for you to feel like you may not know what it's like to be a young woman going through all these kind of things, but you know what it's like to be lonely. You know what it's like to feel like nobody wants to hear from you, or things like that. So I appreciate those things. I also was inspired a lot in terms of my sort of prose style by, guys like Raymond Chandler, right, who was one of the sort of kings of hard-boiled detective
Mhm.
novels.
Sure.
Because the way that, like, if you read a Chandler novel, he never describes a room or a person or a piece of clothing or anything else as if it's just describing that thing. He never does the thing that I see a lot in fantasy novels of, they walked up to the castle and the walls were high and stone and strong and came to peaks and there was a banner waving and the thing. He walks up to a person and, and he'll sort of write, she walked into the room on cigarette legs and, blew
Right.
smoke in my face, right? It's always this kind of judgment about whatever the character is seeing. It's always kind of putting you in their place, but making you see the world through their eyes, through the filter of their particular point of view. And so I love that. So I try to always capture some of that when I'm in my own writing inside of fantasy. I think it's especially important if you're a fantasy novelist to kind of read outside the genre of fantasy, at least occasionally, and kind of let yourself go, oh, here's something that romance writers do really well, or here's something crime writers do really well, or here's something that literary writers who are writing about whatever midlife crises of an academic professor, who may or may not be having an affair with their student or something, like there's always something you can bring in, and that's part of the job. So yeah, those are kind of some of the influences for me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about your books. So I know you had a new book coming out. You've got a few series.
Mhm.
Um, so you start with what you want to talk about when it comes to your books.
Man, I feel like all I ever do is talk about my books. Let's talk about travel and politics, Randy. No, uh, so yes, my latest novel is The Malevolent Eight, um, which is the sequel to The Malevolent Seven. And The Malevolent Seven is kind of a dark, irreverent fantasy about a group of anti-hero mercenary mages going around blowing things up, swearing constantly, and occasionally, if only accidentally, saving the world. Um, but for me, what's fun about the book, other than the kind of Deadpool meets Game of Thrones style of humor, um, was really just the notion of writing about people who thought of themselves. It's not that they are the bad guys that interest me. It's that they think of themselves as the bad guys. It's that they've been told that they're the bad guys. And we now live in a world where it feels like we're always dividing each other up into good guys and bad guys, right? And I would say the problem I have with that is the definition of a bad guy is anyone who's ever done anything bad, and the definition of a good guy is someone who's never done anything bad. In other words, doing good almost stops mattering. It's just, did you ever do something horrible? um, or did you ever do something we don't approve of? And suddenly we have this thing where and I don't want to really comment too much on cancel culture, because I think often it's overblown. Often our commentary on it is itself a kind of a way of trying to beat up the left or whatever, which is not generally something I'm that interested in. Um, but the problem that I see sometimes is when we've decided someone's a bad guy and we literally never want them to do anything good again, because like that offends us. So, I can't speak to, Kevin Spacey. I don't know much about him other than the fact that he was a great actor. Probably did some horrible things, probably may or may not, gotten what he deserves. But if tomorrow Kevin Spacey ran into a burning building and saved 3 kittens, people would be horrified. They'd be like, "How dare he? How dare that horrible person do that? They're just trying to look good. They should have burned in the fire." Like that's a terrible position for us to get into as a society, because, and this is one of the scary things I think we all have to come to grips with, is for us to all survive, we need people, we need bad guys, we need people that we hate to do the right thing more often than not. And in fact, a lot of people that we despise actually do the right thing more often than not. And the moment that we start telling people, hey, because we've told you you're a bad guy, you're no longer allowed to do the right thing, or you're not obliged to do the right thing, that's when things fall apart. And so when I was writing The Malevolent Seven, Cade, who's the main character, he thinks of himself as a bad guy. He tried to be a good guy when he was younger. It really didn't work out. Now he's just like, you know what? We're horrible, but that's how it is. But over the course of the book, he starts to realize more and more that he's going to have to step up, because sometimes there just aren't any good guys around when you need them. And so, the sequel, The Malevolent Eight, is about him and his band of homicidal war mages trying to prevent this kind of supernatural war that's going to engulf the mortal realm and basically turn all of humanity into toy soldiers for these 2 different supernatural forces. And if I haven't sold that well enough, by the way, for your audience, let me just say it's the only work of fiction to feature a vampire dragon kangaroo. So what else do you need? Run out and buy 20 copies of The Malevolent Eight.
So I saw that you used that as a selling point for that book as well. You went and you told him, it says, yeah, vampire kangaroo. Well,
Yeah.
that's all it takes, right?
Yeah, it was funny. I've told this story a lot, so I won't sort of belabor it here. But Malevolent Seven was a much more successful book than anyone anticipated. I wasn't even planning to sell it or even self-publish it. It was my agent said he wanted to read it and then insisted on selling it. And then suddenly it was, publisher picked it up. And then it became this very successful book. And so he called me up and said, they'd like a sequel. And I said, great, go get me a check. And he said, well, no, you have to write a proposal first. And for those in your audience who might not be aware of this, typically, when you're just starting out, you have to write a full book, and then you send it, and it goes on Slush Piles, and hopefully a publisher goes, "Hey, we love this, we're going to buy it." Once you're sort of at a certain level, they go to this mode of saying, write us a proposal, and a fiction proposal has sample titles you're thinking of and the gist of the book and who the audience is and sample chapters and a detailed synopsis. And I hate writing book proposals. I mean, I hate it. It never works out for me. So I said, why do I have to write a book proposal when they only want the sequel because the first book was successful? And he said, that's just how it is. But you know what? You don't have to rush. Take a few weeks. And I got off the phone and I went, forget it. I'm going to spend 1 hour on this and no more. Even the sample was written in that hour. I didn't write 3 chapters. I just wrote this horrific scene, almost in a Hollywood treatment style, just on the page of just angels, angelic beings being tortured to death with nooses made from 3-foot long centipedes and, all this kind of grotesque stuff. Cause I was trying to play a prank on my agent by sending him this absolutely intolerable book proposal with a cover letter that was very formal and polite. But then he tricked me by sending it to the publishers anyway. And so one of the things I'd realized as I was writing the proposal and my timer's running out was I need 7 characters in this sort of scene that I'm setting up on in the proposal, and I'd only had 6 from the previous book. And so I just went, whatever. And then there's Temper, a 7-foot tall, kind of rabbit-looking creature, but with shorter ears and this big long tail that he wraps around the necks of his enemies before punching them to death and then drinking the blood from their split skulls. And I went, yeah, he's a vampire kangaroo. Get over it. And that was the whole thing. And I sent this whole proposal to my agent, and then he, because he's also got the sense of humor of a 13-year-old boy, sent it to the publishers. And 3 days later, they just wrote a 1-sentence email back that said, you had us at Vampire Kangaroo. And that was it. And they didn't buy a sequel. They bought 2. So now I'm about to start work on Malevolent 9.
So Malevolent 7, of course, sounds a lot like the Magnificent 7. Is there some correlation there, similar in any way, or?
Well, you probably interview a fair number of fantasy authors. So you probably know that I think deep down, almost every fantasy author secretly wants to write their version of fantasy Magnificent 7. So Magnificent 7, but with wizards. In fact, a colleague of mine, Cameron Johnston, had a book come out that ended up, I wrote Malevolent 7 back in 2020, but he had a book come out, I think the year before, 6 months before Malevolent 7. And that book was called Maleficent 7. Mm-hmm. And so, we just figured great minds think alike. But yeah, there is that element of it. There's something really fun about that story shape of picking up one character after another as you put together this misfit band, right? That's kind of a classic. There's certain types of story shapes that we see a lot. There's the one where the group of heroes are traveling across this country, this continent. And so you're just seeing every different place as they go. It's almost like a travelogue, right? Fellowship of the Ring, the Lord of the Rings generally almost feels like a travelogue. You're just going across Middle Earth. But I really love that story shape of you're just meeting one crazy character after another as they slowly come together to form this group that has to deal with this, climactic conflict. So, but the problem, of course, is, almost no one's seen the sequel to to Magnificent 7. In fact, there were 2 sequels. It's just hardly anybody ever watched them. Mm-hmm. So, once you're there, once you've had that whole, okay, you brought your misfit group together and they've done this big thing, now you have to find new story shapes to tell. And so that was an interesting challenge when I was writing the Malevolent 8. But I found one that I just sort of fell in love with and has all the weirdness and the sort of irreverent sometimes foul-mouthed humor of Malevolent Seven, but kind of amps up the stakes and deepens the character relationships. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to sitting down and writing Malevolent Nine.
And of course, going back to the original,
Yeah.
the use of the samurai sword and all that. You've got swords in yours as well
Yeah.
instead of guns.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, it's funny. I almost never write about firearms. Once in a while, I put a wheel lock pistol in a book because I love wheel lock. Like, I think wheel lock pistols are just really interesting. They're also interesting historically, because they were replaced by the flintlock. So it kind of goes, matchlock. Somebody literally, they're holding a pistol. They have to light this wick, wait for it to go and keep holding it and hope the guy doesn't move. And then, and then the lead ball comes out.
Right.
They went to the wheel lock, which is this incredibly baroque, complicated mechanism that has like a spinning wheel that causes a spark to form to light the powder in the chamber to set off the other powder to fire the lead ball, which was then went to the flintlock, which is a much simpler mechanism. And we often assume that flintlocks were better than wheel locks, but they actually weren't. It's just that they were much cheaper to make. So sometimes I'll write with guns. Most my swashbuckling novels, the Great Coat series, which began with Trader's Blade, which was a pretty big series for me, and it was also optioned for television. There's a lot of sword fighting naturally in there. That's kind of, and that was really, in some ways, debut novels are always dangerous because they're the thing often that you get most associated with. But in my case, of course, because I also then wrote the Spellslinger series, and because that was sort of so successful kind of worldwide and, was translated into so many languages, that was all about magic and dueling. But there was kind of a Western sort of vibe to that as well. But with the Malevolent series, it's really about, these kind of anti-heroic, emotionally compromised mages, blowing things up. So there's lots of different magic systems and things like that are fun. But like I said, when we were talking about, fight choreography, it's really for me about finding these elements that they're entertaining, they're fun to imagine, but then asking the question, okay, how do I turn them into a kind of a language, a kind of a dialogue? So when the character is doing something, you also know what they're saying by doing that thing, right? In the same way as, in real life, when you show up at home on a random day with a bouquet of flowers, what you're probably saying is, sorry for that stupid thing I did, honey.
So I find, as an author, when I talk to fantasy authors, creating those fantasy worlds fascinating. It's something that I don't think I have the talent for. But where do you start? Are you starting with just characters and then you're building that fantasy world around it, or how does it all come together for you? And I'm assuming you're more of a plotter than a pantster, but I'm guessing.
No, actually, it's I think of myself as a prospector. Like, I'm just digging for gold, and I'll go wherever I have to get it. That's really what it's about for me. So I have written 40, 50, 60 page outlines for novels that I've then completely ignored. I've written novels that started from a single sentence, and I never will an outline trouble me along the way. It's every book is different. When I was writing Play of Shadows, I was trying to think how I was going to approach that book, and then I thought, you know what, it's about theaters and theater magic. So I wrote basically a play of it first, as a way to kind of get myself into that thought space. So for me, every book is a different challenge. And the Malevolent books, it's really important to me that I not overplot. Because when you're writing about characters who are a little bit off center, and what I mean by that is, one of the things I wanted to explore in this series is that the notion that magic is not that good for the mind. The ability to hurl thunderbolts from breaches between the mortal realm and a temporal plane is not really good for your mental health. Or, having totemic magic associated with some particular animal, might cause you to kind of fetishize that animal a little bit, to sort of think that they're the greatest thing ever. Or, all these different forms of magic and all the different ways that they would affect you. And so that means I need my characters to be a little, off kilter a lot of the time, which means if I just sort of outline for plot, if I just sort of outline for, oh, well, this all just makes sense in the sort of epic fantasy style that a lot of writers go with, then I'm going to end up shoehorning my characters into situations that they might not choose to get into. So it's more important that I kind of get them into trouble and then ask, like, what's the weirdest way you try to get yourself out of this trouble? And what new trouble will that create? So there's a lot of that goes on. There's one of my favorite things when I was writing Malevolent 8. There's this whole big scene early, in the first third of the book, where they've been captured and tortured by what are called the Lords Devilish, which are, in this sort of world, the equivalent of these sort of 13 kind of demonic high lords, or they try to position themselves that way. And, they're kind of pompous about it. And so there's this whole Hieronymus Bosch torture scene, if you've ever seen the Hieronymus Bosch paintings, that Cade is just having none of, because he's just so pissed off about it, because he knows this is just a prelude to negotiation. So he starts warning them, like, hey, I get it. You have to rough us up a little bit. It's part of the package. But if you take one step further, I'm going to really make you pay for this. And so because all that was happening, there was a moment later in the book where Cade is suddenly captured by a different group of people. And I went, oh, if he's kidnapped, for sure they want him to do this spell that's going to turn him into a kind of a living gate into this other realm. So of course they're going to end up torturing him. But, who wants more torture? So I literally have him tell the reader, like, and yeah, of course I was going to be tortured. But you probably don't want to know about that. So let me tell you how I met the vampire kangaroo. And so then we cut to this whole chapter of how the vampire kangaroo came to that plane of existence. And at the end of it, Cade says, now, isn't that better than, having to learn about, somebody being tortured again? And they go, then again, here's exactly what happened. And then he goes and describes the whole next, torture scene that happens to him. And it just gets more kind of bizarre and hilarious as you go. But, but always with that sense of underlying drama, of underlying sincerity about they are these guys that are not qualified to be the good guys, but there's nobody else. So they're kind of doing their best, but they're not always very good at it. So that's what I love getting to write. And if I were to have done that in an outline, there's no way I would have done it that way.
Yeah, I'm a pantser myself, and sometimes it's fun writing your characters into a corner and figuring your way out of it. I think that sometimes you don't necessarily mean to. I know for me, I don't necessarily mean to do it, but I sometimes, when it gets into the flow, it's like, oh, wait a minute, now I've got him in this situation. How do you get him out? Might be a little easier for you being a fantasy. I do crime thrillers and stuff, but you can come up with some magic potion or something maybe to get yourself out of it. But I'm sure you don't try to make it, like Dallas did, where, you just say it was a dream sequence, right? And get out of it. You try to be a little more, a little better idea than something simple.
No, absolutely. I mean, hey, but I'm not buying the whole, we crime writers have to, stick to, authenticity. Because, wasn't Elmore Leonard said, when in doubt, have a guy come into the room with a gun. So, there's all kinds of cheats for all of this. I find with fantasy actually that it's more perilous as you're writing it in some ways, because whatever that solution is that gets them out of trouble, it has to feel authentic, and it has to feel true. And the thing that makes it feel true may not be the laws of physics as they exist on our world, but it has to be the laws of humanity as they exist on our world. It has to be, oh, I see what happened there because, we saw that in that character earlier on, that they were on the fence about this, and something that Cade did persuaded them in the end to change sides, or, it has to feel genuine. Otherwise it just, loses all coherence, right away. And that's something, honestly, when I pick up a fantasy novel and, as I say, I like to read fantasy, but I sometimes find it hard, because if I pick up a fantasy novel and I start reading, and it's just about the fantasy, it's just about, isn't magic cool and isn't conflict cool, it just falls apart for me so quickly. Because basically all you're doing at that point is having to learn a whole bunch of words and names and countries and stuff for something that doesn't exist and doesn't really mean anything. George R. R. Martin, when he did the Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire series, one of the things he did that was so brilliant was he made you have reason to care about all of these hundreds and thousands of different characters and places and histories and conflicts. And he did that by making them meaningful, not in the sense that they are historically accurate or even because of the historical parallels, but simply because they resonated with things we know about each other as human beings, and things we fear and things we hope for. And you saw those connections. And so you went, yeah, okay, it's worth memorizing the Starks versus the Lannisters, and which Stark was this guy and which was this other guy. Like, you have to make the readers invest in that. So yeah, you can't play fast and loose with the, like, and then it turned out the magic sword had this other power.
Well, that's a good segue, because I always ask this questions of everybody, and we're getting about 51 minutes here. It's all about the characters in my mind. I even wrote that in one of my latest one of my latest newsletters. I talked about that. Without good characters, the story doesn't hold together. So, what do you look for? What do you try to do to bring life to those characters in your fantasy world, or in your sci-fi, or even in your hard-boiled fiction?
I really start from a kind of perspective. Like I was saying earlier, that when Raymond Chandler wrote a character walking in a room, you didn't have to know anything about the character themselves. The narrator. You didn't have to know whether they're male or female, what their race was, what their height was, what their background was, because once you got their perspective on the world, whether it's walking into a rich person's house and just seeing, either seeing how magnificent it is, or seeing how it's all a veneer, how it's all a fake, that's what creates a character that I want to follow. It's a character who's got a perspective. So I often start from a character's perspective, and then I'll kind of build out their history as I'm building out the world. And I'm building the world based on their response to it. I want to see more of that perspective come out. And so I'll build the world such that it allows for more of that. It allows for them to do that. So that was true right from my debut novel, Trader's Blade. Falcio, what right away about him as a main character is he was this very idealistic guy. He thought the greatest thing you could be is a greatcoat, one of these traveling magistrates who rode across the country trying to bring, the rule of law to people and holding trials and sometimes having to duel to enforce their verdicts, but now lives in this completely corrupt time where the greatcoats have been, accused of being traitors and cowards, and the knights, who in this world are basically just armed thugs, everybody treats as heroes. And so I'm creating this, I'm starting with that perspective. What would it be like to have wanted your whole life to be a certain kind of hero, to have made it to that point, and then have everyone say, you're not a hero, you're a piece of garbage, And so, that's how that plays out. In the case of, there's a novel I'm writing right now that's, I think, going to be coming out next year. It's the first book in a series called The Path of Swords. And it's about, which is a YA progression fantasy series. And the thing I wanted to write about in terms of the character is the main character's name is Caleb. And I chose to have him be from kind of a backwoods place in Kentucky, because he ends up in this sort of very elite academy, in this sort of place that you can't find, on a map, because there's so much fantasy fiction now that's set in these sort of academia. They sometimes call it dark academia or something. It's these universities that we all wish we could have gone to because they're full of magic and intrigue and danger. But I wanted to have it be, the kid who everybody, just because of how he looks and talks, they just assume, oh, he's just some kind of, redneck. But in fact, his uncle made him learn Latin and Greek and study philosophy and all these different things. And so his whole perspective on the world is interesting to me, because often he has this line that he sometimes says to people: just because you're looking down on me doesn't mean you see who I am. And so I like seeing that perspective play out. So that's kind of where I start from. I virtually never start from, what I want is, a character who's 26 years old and was, does this, and they had this kind of pet when they were a kid, and their parents had these jobs. Like, I never start from there, because to me that's just extraneous until it's meaningful, right? Until it connects to why they are who they are. And the who they are for me is that perspective. It's when they walk into a room and they see a celebrity couple, they see, incredibly handsome Hollywood actor, incredibly beautiful Hollywood actress, and photographers everywhere. I want to know, what do they think about that? I want to know if they find it hilarious or offensive, or if they're in awe of it, or if it makes them angry, and then I go, okay, why does it make them angry? Well, because, there was some big movie production came to town when they were younger, and they wrecked the town and then took off, so that's really the process for me, right? I'm in search of, first, a point of view that I think is interesting, and then I kind of discover, okay, then I just ask myself, okay, well, why do they have that point of view? So that's my process.
Well, and you've obviously written a lot of books,
Mm-hmm.
and you sounds like you got a lot more in the pipeline and stuff. So, since you like to travel a lot, I often ask, are you one of those? Are you diligent? Do you write every day? Are you able to write when you travel? Are you and still be able to see the world?
No, I'm terrible at that stuff. I will go sometimes days or weeks without writing, and then I'll go, what? I've got to just sit down and write every single day for hours a day. I'm a very fast writer when I'm just forcing that gear to come into play, or switching myself into that gear. But sometimes switching yourself into that gear can be pretty tricky. Um, so I do sometimes. My favorite way to write a novel, and I do this sometimes, is to write a novel in a month. Now, this is only something you get to do when you're a full-time novelist and you make enough money that you can kind of afford to do this. But what I tend to write in 4 acts. That's kind of the natural form for me, to think in terms of 4 acts. A lot of people in Hollywood sort of think in 3 acts, but then they always say the second act is twice the length of the first and third acts, and there's a midpoint that separates it. And I'm always like, well, guess what? That's 4 acts. So I tend to actually like to write in 4 acts. And so if you think about it, 4 weeks in a month, and then a few days for epilogues. And what that means is that I know that on Monday, I'm starting a new act. I'm starting the conflict. I know that by Wednesday, if I'm not in the heart of the conflict, I better get there right away. If I'm hitting Friday and I'm not near the climax, I got to get there. And I know that on Sunday, I have to be setting up this change in the act. And so what I love about that as a process is it's kind of like getting to live the story, right? Like, you feel the rhythms of the story because they're matching the rhythms of your own life. Monday morning, has a feeling, Sunday has a feeling. And so when I can do it, I love to do that process. And that's how I wrote Malevolent 7. And that's how I wrote Malevolent 8. And then, in the revision process, or the second draft, can take however long it takes. But there is a part of the writing process that's really just carving your way through that dark forest to get to the other side, where at least on the other side, you can go, oh, now I know what it is I was trying to write about. Like, now that I hit the end, I'm like, okay, well, I really screwed that up, but at least I know what I was trying to do. Because then it's much easier to fix. Like, most novelists, if you give them a broken book, but you know what it's trying to do, they can fix it. But when you're just sitting down and writing, especially if you're more of a pantser, as you were sort of saying, and as I think often applies to me, you're searching first and foremost for like a kind of an impulse, a creative impulse. Like, might be that you're just angry at the world, or it might be that you're just so in love or whatever. But it's something that's making you want to find words to put on the page. But it's only when you get through that first draft, you're like, okay, well, now I know what I was really writing about. So yeah, writing a novel in a month works really well for me. But for example, I was just on a book tour for about 2.5 weeks across Canada and then into the States. And, I hardly wrote at all, except when, something happened where someone was like, hey, we need you to fix this draft so that we can, take it to typesetting. And suddenly, then suddenly I find the writer's block disappears pretty fast when you're in danger of breaching a contract.
Yeah, when you got those deadlines, right?
Yep.
You got to push through it.
Yeah.
So, is there a book you want to write that you haven't written yet?
Oh,
Something different, maybe different genres. You talked about some of the crime novels, and you got the sci-fi coming out. I mean, you've covered a few different genres, so.
yeah. It's funny because so I'm in a pretty lucky position where if I turned around and said, hey, there's this book I really want to write, and if it's fantasy, then chances are pretty good a publisher's going to say, okay, yeah, we're interested in that. Give us a book proposal and 3 sample chapters. And as long as I remember to insult them in the proposal, then I'm usually on safe ground. Um, but that changes from day to day. So I'll tell you this book that there's something I've been feeling the last few years I really want to do. And often for me, the idea for a book comes from hearing a song. Uh, so there's this song by a Seattle band, I think called the Sonics, and it's called Have Love Will Travel. And it's just got this chorus, right? Have love will travel. And I just play on words from, have gun will travel or whatever. And it made me go, I want to write about a group of knights who they break away from their lord, from their, their king, who turns, because he's too awful. And they don't know what to do with themselves. And so they decide, we will go on any quest for anyone as long as it's in service to true love. But these guys have no clue what true love is, because all they know is being knights and being orderly and doing what you're told. All they know is honor and loyalty and, and duty. And so they keep screwing up. And so, for example, they find this young guy whose beloved has been taken away by her nasty uncle and locked in a tower because he wants to marry her off to some rich guy. And so they're like, okay, well, that's true love for sure, because this young guy is really upset. And they go off and they storm the tower and they manage to free the woman. And she says, oh, thank you so much, you saved me. And they say to her, well, don't worry, the good news is we're going to take you back to your true love in the village. And she goes, who? And they realize that, like, she barely knows the guy. He was just obsessed with her. And so it's just that whole, I just love the idea of kind of exploring kind of love and what it means through the eyes of these 4 knights who are utterly unqualified to figure it out, but just determined to kind of do that. And a lot of that is because one of my favorite films of all time, one of the best novels, I think, of the 20th century was Princess Bride by William Goldman.
Sure.
And I haven't seen anything or read anything that ever really made me kind of feel the same way. And so because I'm a big fan of that, I was like, I kind of want to write something that is very different from The Princess Bride, but in some ways is a bit of an homage to it, to that sensibility. So yeah, Knights of Love, I think I was going to call it, which is probably a terrible title, but that's a book I know I'm going to write at some point in the near future.
Well, you mentioned that too, and I've always been a Monty Python fan. Monty Python and the Holy Grail,
Yeah.
and their quest, and all these different little segments that they had, just little skits that are on this quest to find the Holy Grail. I still laugh when I watch that movie all the time. So
it's a classic.
What's that?
I said it's a classic.
Oh yeah. So, do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah, I tend to always tell people, the key. So the first thing is, there's an old adage that everybody, I think, gives, which is, write the book you most want to read. And my twist on that is, I always say, write the book you most want to read as boldly as you possibly can. If there's something you love, write about that with all the intensity you can. Do not tone it down or tamp it down because you think it's not unique enough or because you think it's passé or something like that. And the example I often use is, Twilight, right? Twilight is, not the kind of thing I would usually read. It's got sparkly vampires in it. But if you love sparkly vampires, and then you go and you start writing a book about your sparkly vampires, but then you go, oh, I keep hearing people saying how like tacky that series is or how it's passé or whatever. And so you go, well, I guess I better be more edgy. I make it that they're sparkly, but they're kind of awful, but they're not that sparkly. Or, all you're doing is taking the thing that you love and compromising it because you're afraid that someone's going to tell you that you're not cool enough. And that just doesn't work. You got to go hardcore at what it is you love. Write that book with a flagrant disregard for what people think is cool or passé or not. And Trader's Blade, my debut novel, if somebody reads that, you will find it is every piece of swashbuckling imaginable. But nobody ever reads it and says, oh, this is just a ripoff of, I don't know, the Three Musketeers or something, because the more intensely you go after the book that you want to write, the more distinct it's going to be. And it was true. And it was also true when I wrote The Malevolent Seven. I just went, you know what? I love Magnificent Seven. I like the idea of these anti-hero wizards and screwing things up. And I just went so intense on that, no regard whatsoever for what people on Twitter or wherever else or in the publishing world were saying was hip and cool. You just got to go hardcore at what you love. And then, from there, you just have to, that's the art part, right? I always say, like, if you want to be a good novelist, you have to be good at two things, art and craft, and you can't do them at the same time. When you're going for the art, it's the creative impulse. It's putting on the page all your different thoughts and feelings that you didn't even know were in there. And you're just telling your story. And then the craft part is you got to like tighten it up and make it good and make the prose better and fix, whether a description is too banal or not detailed enough. You got to, make sure that you don't have tons of errors and grammatical errors, or that you haven't written things that are accidentally, hurtful to marginalized communities or things like that. Like those are just, but if you're thinking that stuff, if you're thinking about like protecting yourself while you're trying to write the first draft of a book, to me, I wouldn't be able to do it. If I have to think about, how are people going to receive this, or is somebody going to say, oh, he's an old white man, he shouldn't be writing this book, or just, he's not this person, or this is a tired trope or something. If I'm thinking those thoughts while I'm writing, like, I'm screwed. I got nothing to say. So I have to really, and often when I'm writing a novel in a month, what I'll do is I'll get up first thing in the morning and I'll write the 2 or 3 chapters, sometimes just one chapter, but sometimes more. But I'm writing them pure art. Like, no, I'm not looking up a word. I'm not, nothing like that. I'm just writing whatever my subconscious or my storytelling instinct tells me to write. And then in the afternoon, I'll completely rewrite it. I'll retype it literally on a different computer, and I'll retype. And that's when I'll look things up. I'll look for the right word. I'll ask myself the question, does this sentence flow properly? All that craft stuff, which is wonderful, but the craft comes after the art. So that's the advice I always give people is, like, you got to, write what you love as boldly as you possibly can. And then trust that afterwards you can fix what needs to be fixed. But if you haven't got any juice in that first draft, it's really hard to find it later.
Good advice. It's that's a lot the way I write. I just kind of just sit down and I just type whatever's coming out of my head and my fingers and go from there. And then I come back to it later and work on it some more. So you've got some events coming up. We're about an hour and 10 minutes, so we'll start to wrap up here. You've got some events coming up. Tell us about where you're going to be you've already done some promotion for the new book, but you've got a few more you've got coming.
I'm mostly wrapped up. So I did some events in the UK, and then I just finished this tour of Canada, and then a couple of stops in the US, and then I'm in Vancouver I'm going to be at the Indigo at Park Royal in North Vancouver this Saturday. If someone goes to my website, decastell.com, and goes to the events page, they can see, where I'm going to be. And then I think next week I'm at the South Dakota Festival of Books, which should be a lot of fun. I'm doing a bunch of events with them, so that'll be a blast. And then I come back, and I'll have a few days before flying off to Tunisia for a couple of weeks. And then I come back, and then I got to go right into writing Malevolent Nine. So it's going to be hectic.
So the South Dakota Festival of Books, we do an event in South Dakota every year in Deadwood, and it sounds like this is going to be in Spearfish, which is just up the road from Deadwood, and we actually take our motorhome and stuff. But that's a beautiful, beautiful part of the country. Hopefully, no snow. Late September, it could be a little iffy sometimes in that area, but might not be too bad.
Holy mackerel! Snow in September? Now you're freaking me out.
Oh, well, we get that in Denver here in Colorado where I live. So
Wow.
it does happen. It hasn't happened for a few years, but it's been a little too warm. But it's always possible, and it'll be chilly at night for sure up
Okay. All right. Well, now
So-
I know to update my packing list,
there.
because I was just on this tour. I was like, I got to find every short sleeve shirt I own, and like every lightweight, pair of trousers, and because it's been really quite hot this summer.
Right.
So I guess, yeah, I'll pack my parka when I go to South Dakota.
It still might be warm during the day,
Yeah.
maybe. But yeah, South Dakota, Spearfish, but a beautiful area. It's a lot to see there. A lot of trees and green grass, and it's a great area. So I put your website up there. I was very impressed with your website. You have like, I don't know how many different languages in your website. I don't think I've ever seen a website that has a drop down that says different languages, and it must have been 15 different ones. It's like whoever manages that for you
I know.
needs a pay raise.
I know. Don't tell them that, because they might hear this interview. No, it's true. It's because I was lucky enough that a lot of my books have been translated in other languages, and I meet readers in those other countries, and often they're just sort of left behind entirely by authors. The book gets translated, and that's sort of it. And so I wanted to at least have something like a landing page, at least in each language. And yeah, I torture my webmaster periodically, because I'll send him a link to a new book, and sometimes the book's in Hebrew, because there's Israeli translations of the Spellslinger series, which means the language is written right to left, and so I'm like,
Right.
enjoy formatting this.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's helpful. Yeah, I always say I've had 17 novels published, but if you look at every edition in every language, it ends up being quite a lot more. Fortunately, I'm not the one who has to do the work of translating them. So,
Well, I can't even imagine what's involved in doing that. And obviously, sentence structure is different in various languages and all that, and making sure that it actually works. And it's not like you can probably read it and go, hey, that line is in the wrong place. It needs to be.
No, absolutely. Look, literary translators are geniuses, because they have to capture all these different things, like the idioms. It's not just translating the words,
Right.
but translating the idioms into idioms that make sense in that culture, but also being aware of just how people contextualize things within that culture. So just very subtle things that are different. My favorite, though, I can't remember which language this was, but one of a translator reached out to me, and I think it was for the Greatcoats books, and said, "Hey, listen, is it okay if I change Brasty's name? Brasty's one of the trio of characters in Traitor's Blade. Is it okay if I change his name, because in our language it's a very rude word?" So
I'm sure that comes up a lot.
I remember the French translator for Spellslinger, because there's an animal in there, the talking squirrel cat, and she was so proud she came up with a word chacuré for squirrel cat. So she sort of invented a French word, invented a kind of portmanteau word that meant squirrel cat in French. And so yeah, That's a whole bizarre world. One day, you should get a translator on the show and just because they seem like they have the most fascinating struggles imaginable.
That's a good idea. I think that I have to find one. If you know one, you send me a name. So I definitely would do that. I'm sure even like what you said, your guys in the Malevolent Seven swear a lot too. I'm sure some of that also has to have some different translations also.
Oh yeah, well, because I think the Malevolent series is getting translated into German, and anytime you translate something in German, it adds 50% of to the book because it's a much because the language everything takes a lot longer to say for reasons I do not know because I don't speak German. But yeah, it really like a book that's an inch thick in English is an inch and a half thick in German. So yeah. I have no idea how they're going to translate the some of the swearing, but these guys they're super talented. These literary translators. We're all going to be much poorer off when we start using AI for translating books.
Yeah, it's a whole nother discussion about AI. Yeah, AI will do it, and it'll screw it up for a while. Like it's getting better, but it's always interesting. So,
Yeah.
well, I wanted to say thanks. Was there anything else we needed to cover when it comes to anything of your books?
No, just thanks a lot for having me on. It's good getting a chat, and I think I'm flying through Denver on the way to South Dakota. So,
Oh,
I'll
really? Coming here first and then
yeah,
going to Rapid City, probably?
yep. So
Yeah.
I'll try to wave from the airport.
Well, the airport's out east. We're on the west side of town, but my wife is she's living in Utah for a work project for 3 weeks. So I might even be at the airport picking her up about the time you're landing. So
There you go.
it may be possible. So
All
well,
right.
great. Thank you. I appreciate it. I enjoyed talking with you, hearing more about all your books and your process. And hopefully we'll run into each other. Our plan is, and we'll see how it's going, is we're going to probably go to BoucherCon and Calgary, and so we'll be in Canada. So hopefully I get to meet Mickey too,
Yep.
who kind of connected us and stuff because he lives just outside of Calgary, from what I understand. But
That's right.
but that'll be our trip to Canada. I got to get my passport in order. You know your passport's got lots of stamps on it. So
Yep. Yeah. No, I have my two passports, my Canadian and my British passport, or my UK passport. But yeah, when you're in Calgary, well, maybe you'll be able to make a little side trip to Vancouver, and we can say hi in
yeah,
person.
yeah. Hopefully, we definitely are going to get to Vancouver one of these days. That was on our list when we got married. It didn't happen. We decided to buy a house instead. So getting close to the 30th anniversary. So a Vancouver trip was in the future. So well,
Sounds good.
thank you again. Enjoyed talking with you. Take care. Good luck with your new book and all the books you got coming out.
Likewise. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. I appreciate everyone watching tonight. My next guest will be next Monday. It'll be Gregory Wittes, who I met at a Tropicon event in Branson, Missouri this past year, and another mystery writer. So we'll be talking mystery crime stuff. So hopefully you'll join us next week. Take care, everyone.